You want me to print 700,000 pages because you don't like PDFs? No problem. But it's going to cost you. My first job after university was at an aerospace company, pretty well known for its passenger planes. I got up to speed quickly and started optimizing a bunch of outdated processes. One of the biggest money savers I rolled out was a shift from paper documents to PDFs. The company used an insane amount of A4 and A3 paper every day, and laser printer and copier techs were basically on retainer, showing up once a week. My work saved the company around $5,000 in the first month alone. And that number kept growing every month as more and more stages of engineering review and document processing moved into protected PDFs. About 2 years after I started, my boss's boss hired a guy from Kansas who talked in this exaggerated slow drawl. He hopped from job to job and landed with us because a friend had just become a manager in our division. That friend was one of the few managers who refused to adopt my secure PDF licensing and review system. By that time, I'd already been promoted a couple of times and was leading a team of 10. I supervised their work and sent results to my boss, who now spent less time on my old tasks and more on automation, like training people to press F7 and take 5 minutes to run a spell check. Then he wrote a script that did the same thing for every document, so we didn't have to pay FAA inspectors for rejecting documents over stupid punctuation and spelling errors. Officially, the Kansas guy was hired as an editor. That meant I had to work with him on the document submission process and get his input on how to integrate manual review for special business lines into our system. It went extremely badly. In our first meeting, it took him more than a minute to finish a sentence with fewer than 10 words, not counting repeats and dramatic stretched-out noises. In the second meeting he told me, "Son, you gotta slow down, or you're gonna automate yourself right out of a job." Decades later, when I first played Red Dead Redemption 2 and heard Arthur Morgan talk, I almost turned the game off. If Arthur spoke 20 words in 50 seconds, that's exactly how this Kansas guy sounded. To put it mildly, it was maddening. Eventually, our clash hit a peak when he'd been given enough authority to demand printed copies of documents before he would review them. At one point, he slowed things down so badly that he created bottlenecks in 4 separate projects, all in the name of properly teaching people how to edit. He worked overtime and took work home, which, as far as I could tell, meant he left the stack of papers on his kitchen table and watched football. Since he was hourly, it meant any task he reviewed ended up taking twice the planned man-hours. And because our PDF review system required logging in, which tracked connection time, access, and document changes, he really didn't like it. Me, I was on salary and perfectly happy with that. But I had to watch this clown burn hours and days on things that could have been done in minutes if he'd just learned to press 3 buttons, and he flat out refused. Eventually, I went to the director of engineering and explained what was happening. That turned into a meeting with the Kansas guy's buddy, the manager who tried his hardest to argue that my PDF review system was insecure, which was a lie. He claimed it was inefficient, also a lie. And he insisted the right way was whatever made the Kansas guy comfortable. Months went by, and the project stalled mostly because of Kansas's review process. Finally, in the last week before the deadline, my team finished everything required on our side. On Monday, the director called me in and said that since that engineering manager was now tied up with a new project, all final decisions on documentation and installation instructions were up to him, and my team had to fully support them. Then he invited me to play golf with him that weekend. I don't play golf. Never have. I mean, I can play mini golf if I've had 4 shots and a beer. The last time I played real golf, I somehow managed to hit the caddy with the ball twice. No one has ever figured out how I pulled that off. So yeah, asking me to play golf is not a great idea. For the record, I even Googled it for you. A caddy is the guy who carries the clubs, helps pick the right one, judges distance to the hole, and gives advice during the game. Then I got a memo, an actual piece of paper in the age of email from the Kansas guy, an invitation to a document submission process meeting. By lunch, I'd already sat through 4 hours of meetings with him and his boss, the manager. Almost everyone in the company called the nitpicker or the pedant to the Sarah Griffer. With smug faces, they laid out their requirements for submitting every single document. Now that they'd been given free rein to bring the project home, the two of them sat there dictating exactly how everything had to be done. Every document had to be ready by Friday afternoon for the Kansas guy, and his paid interns, basically the only people who hadn't quit his team, to personally review every single page. That was, by the way, more than 700,000 pages of reports, assessments, drawings, installation instructions, and everything else. They made sure to emphasize that the project was under the personal supervision of the company president. And they insisted that everything be printed on paper. By the end of the meeting, these smug assholes were grinning ear to ear, absolutely glowing with self-satisfaction. At that point, the company had so few printers left that the only machine truly capable of handling that load was a giant copier, printer in the document archive. Everything else was standard office lasers that could maybe chew through 3 boxes of paper before choking. To print that many pages, we'd have to use every printer in the building. We could have hired an outside vendor, but not in the time we had. And since documentation production technically fell under my responsibilities, all of this landed right in my lap. They also said that if I managed to get it done by Friday, the company would get a bonus from the client. That was a big deal. We wanted to impress them to get more contracts in the future. And of course, the company profit-sharing rules meant the visible faces of the project, those two would get the bonuses. Everyone else who actually did the work? We'd get a $5 Starbucks gift card. Yes, really. On Tuesday, I pulled all 10 people off their current tasks and reassigned them to printing. We occupied every printer in the building, including the president's personal laser printer and the Xerox machine his secretary used. My team worked 4 hours of overtime every day, fueled by pizza, beer, and mountains of paper. We turned our big conference rooms into improvised print shops, and I set myself up in the archive with the big beast of a printer to handle the bulk of the job. By the end of the week, our coworkers were flooding us with complaints. They whined that the conference rooms were taken over for our print operation. They whined that we'd used up all the staples and paper. They whined that the print queues were clogged for hours. At one point, even the FAA representative overseeing the project stormed in and demanded to know when he'd finally be able to print his files, the ones we actually needed to submit this mountain of crap. We finished Thursday night with about 3 hours to spare before the Friday morning deadline. We delivered the whole thing to the Kansas guy's workstation. All 700,000 pages in boxes formed a stack roughly 2 cubic meters in volume. We carefully arranged them in his cubicle, obeying ISO 9000 procedures and safety rules so we didn't block the emergency exit. And, as required, we also sent an electronic copy of everything to the FAA inspector, who was supposed to review the package before submission, especially any documents that differed from standard ones, or had been added at the client's request, or were formatted using new methods. He wanted to see new or changed pages in print, but only those. Just to be clear, yes, we had basically buried the Kansas guy's desk in paper. But that's still not the truly evil part of the story. When I first joined the company, one of the other new hires in my orientation group had a habit of inserting a tiny vector image, the mascot of his university, into every file he created. It was so small that even on a full-size engineering drawing you couldn't really see it. It was his little joke. A couple of engineers who graduated from a rival university copied the idea and started inserting their own mascot as a vector graphic into their drawings. Then someone created a vector model from a popular 1980 seconds cartoon, a robot that transforms into an airplane. At a certain scale, it didn't look like a robot at all, just a tiny standard metric bolt, and they added it to the standard parts library as a component labeled, "Do not use this template." None of that obviously is allowed in official engineering specs, even as a tiny hidden drawing. Even if the plotter at maximum zoom can't tell whether it's a school mascot, a maple leaf, or some dumb 80 seconds robot, it's still not okay. The only reason they'd gotten away with it was that nobody was dumb enough to scale up every CAD component and check what each part really looked like. When I realized what could happen if anyone noticed, or if those models made it into an official submission package, I had the engineers who'd done it go back through their old drawings and remove all the mascots. I also asked them to spread the word to anyone else who might be doing it. Since you can search the engineering database by part number, I tagged the affected drawings for editing so responsible people would clean them up. Unfortunately, nobody knew that a certain pedantic manager, our beloved nitpicker, had added his own vector picture to his team's templates. His graphic was a maple leaf with a naked woman, legs spread, holding a hockey stick right in front of her crotch. That lovely piece of work never made it into the standard template database, because the engineering team and the template review group I'd created never received his templates at all. He refused to use standard templates because they didn't live up to his standards. And nobody knew he'd left that trash on every template he forced his team to use, because he was one of the holdouts who refused to register drawings through the central database until he personally approved them. He still uploaded final versions to the approved drawings database, but only after they'd already been sent to both the client and the FAA. So the latest versions were in there, but he refused to participate in the rest of the process. His excuse was simple: my team works better this way. In practice, that meant any part number he assigned on his own frequently conflicted with existing numbers in the database. We kept having to hold meetings to untangle the mess, explaining that maybe he should check the database before creating a second part with the same number in a totally different drawing. To make things worse, This guy slapped his name on almost every drawing, no matter who actually did the work. So anyone who needed details about a project had to go to him, not the engineer who built the model. His group had the highest turnover in the entire company for many reasons. But the main one was that he kept stealing credit for drawings he'd never touched in a company where your number of completed drawings directly affected your performance review. Add to that his obsession with pointless work that brought no value to the client. And of course, he behaved like a complete jerk toward anyone who dared say no, especially those who refused to work weekends when his team inevitably fell behind. This massive project was no exception. As part of the submission package, the nitpicker demanded that we print and attach to every engineering drawing a full catalog of every modeled part and component, so the client who had never asked for this could supposedly identify each part they needed. His logic? Since we supply 60% of these parts, this guarantees the client will know they can only buy them from us. You know what the only thing he agreed to automate was? A script that expanded every component in a drawing to full-page size and included it in the official parts list. You can probably see where this is going. I took Friday off, but Monday morning I got a call from the VP's personal assistant. She asked me to come in immediately for an important meeting. Friday afternoon, I walked into the conference room next to my director's office. His face was the stoniest I'd ever seen as he opened the door and let me into one of the loudest dressing downs I've ever witnessed. At the table were the FAA representative, the company president, our division VP, the Kansas guy, and the nitpicker. The FAA rep, usually a jolly round guy, was screaming at the nitpicker and Kansas at the top of his lungs, explaining how serious this was and how badly they would have humiliated the company if this garbage had actually been submitted. He said that if he'd allowed this package through, it would have triggered a full review of every document he'd ever approved while working with our company. When the shouting finally died down a bit, my director asked if I knew about any non-standard drawings or graphics in our engineering CAD database. I said yeah. There are template example parts that get automatically removed when someone copies the template to their local drive. They're clearly labeled as examples. Nobody leaves them in, and they can't. They're removed as soon as you save a local copy. That's when the VP, a woman in her 40s who'd been hired to clean out the old boys club culture, held up a thick stack of printed pages. Each showed a huge vector image 18+ rated maple leaf hockey pinup art with a gross sexual pun in the part number, all neatly formatted as 3D isometric engineering diagrams. My jaw dropped, and I think I made some weird half-choked noise that might have passed for a suppressed laugh. The VP said, "You're seriously telling me you keep this in your template library as an example?" and shook the stack. The FAA rep looked ready to explode again. She turned to me and said, "Kansas and Nitpicker say you're responsible for maintaining the engineering parts database. So explain to everyone here what this is doing in there. Can you honestly say you've never seen this image before?" I glanced at Kansas and the Nitpicker. They were staring at me like chickens watching a man with an axe walk toward the sharpening stone. Because I had seen a full-size printout of that drawing once colored in with markers and lying on the Kansas guy's desk. I'd even told him, "Hey, you should probably get rid of that. You can't have that in the office." He'd rewarded me with a long speech about exactly where I could go. He knew perfectly well that I knew where I'd seen it. And while I didn't know exactly where he'd gotten it from, it wasn't hard to guess. Both of them also knew I had zero interest in pretending I'd take the fall for them. The bus was already rolling downhill. I hadn't thrown them under it, but I sure as hell wasn't going to pull them out. I opened my mouth a couple of times without sound, then said, "Yes, I can honestly say that image is not in the official engineering parts database. Never has been. I can show you exactly what's in there in the part number history. I'm certain that part number doesn't exist." So I opened the template database on my director's computer. We went through the entire template library, checked every possible permutation of that number, until the VP was satisfied. Then she asked, "And you and your team didn't see this while you were printing all week?" "I can't speak for everyone," I said. "But if any of us had seen it, we'd have reacted immediately. We would have reported it to the drawing reviewer, the Kansas guy, and to the engineer whose name is on the drawing, the nitpicker. To have it removed right away. We can run a search on the entire CAD database and find every drawing where this part number appears if we enable search on hidden elements." The nitpicker said, "Oh no, that'll take too long. We have to submit everything by the end of the day." And the Kansas guy, for the first time in his life speaking almost without pauses, repeated the same sentence word for word. The president, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. "This project is frozen until we know exactly how compromised these drawings are. Every drawing containing this part must be reviewed by at least 3 people, One of them the lead engineer who signed off on it, and at least one senior engineering manager not connected to this project. We will not tolerate this crap. Kansas and the nitpicker went pale as paper and stared at me with pleading eyes. The axe was razor sharp now. The only question was whether we'd be serving fried chicken or roast duck today. The president looked at me and said, "Run the search. I don't care how long it takes. I want a printed copy of every drawing containing that part on the VP's desk and identical copies in front of everyone in this room with the names of the creator, the reviewer, and the approving engineer." I was one of the few people with admin access to the CAD parts database because I'd helped build it. I'd set up a rule, forcing every user to change their password every month to a 16-character string with numbers and special symbols. I knew for a fact nobody else currently had access. My director knew it too. He used to have access, but after forgetting his password one too many times, he asked to be removed from the list. I said, "Sure. It'll take at least 6 hours. Do you want me to stay and finish it today?" My director glanced at the VP and the president, then said, "No. You and your team have already worked over 80 hours this week to hit this deadline. Take the weekend. Bring us the results by Monday afternoon." Now Kansas and the nitpicker were twitching like they wanted to leap up and run, but didn't dare. I grabbed a hardened laptop from IT, the one I usually use to access the database. I went to the server room, hooked it up, launched the compiler, logged in with my credentials, started the search, locked the screen with my hardware token, pulled it out of the USB slot, slipped it into my pocket, and went home. 10 minutes after I left the building, calls from the office started hitting my cell. Then came email notifications. Since my director would have called from his mobile, not his desk, I knew exactly who it was. Kansas and the nitpicker. So I ignored every call and email. They could go to hell. The next day, I went to that charity golf tournament my director had invited me to. The company president and his wife were there too. All three of them agreed that I was spectacularly bad at golf. At least it was entertaining. I stayed for dinner and the charity auction, got drunk enough that I had to call a cab and ask the club doorman to drive my car home later. Sunday I spent at home recovering. Monday morning I went into the office, opened the IT server room, and the laptop I'd left connected was gone. After talking to IT, I found out that on Saturday morning, the Kansas guy had shown up claiming he urgently needed the laptop to deliver a critical report to the president by day's end. By noon, he'd pressured a help desk tech making $15 an hour into letting him into the server room just to check the laptop. An hour later, he said he was done and left. As I walked past the nitpicker's desk, on my way to my director's office, after hearing about the laptop stunt, I saw Kansas sitting there with him, deep in conversation. Kansas looked at me with a smug grin and started laughing. The nitpicker still looked nervous, but calmer than he should have. After a short 5-minute talk, my director said, "You know, you didn't actually have to bring printed copies or come in on Saturday morning. You could have just sent us PDFs." "Yeah," I said. "But you know how much Kansas and nitpicker love their paper." Then I walked over and handed each of them a thick stack of printed data from the database. Looking them straight in the eyes, I added, "Anyway, I was already up early on Saturday for the golf tournament. I had to return the president's laser printer, so I printed the lists too. Everyone else got their copies on Saturday morning." Those lists showed every engineering drawing produced by the nitpicker's team. On every single page, his name was listed as the engineer of record or the approving engineer. The Kansas guy was listed as reviewer. More than 40,000 engineering drawings contained that NSFW vector image. And the project itself had nearly 150,000 pages of documentation that referenced those drawings and used their vector elements. By noon, both the nitpickers and Kansas's workstations were completely empty. Security escorted the nitpicker out of the building after firing him on the spot. Kansas, realizing which way the wind was blowing, managed to hand in his resignation before HR finished the paperwork to fire him too. I left that company a few years later. I'd love to say those two never worked in aerospace again, but sadly, within a couple of months, they both landed jobs at a major aircraft manufacturer. And that, in a nutshell, is why I left aviation. Edit. If you don't understand why that tiny little thing nobody could even see on the engineering drawing is such a serious problem, let me spell it out. Even when it's invisible on paper, the models submitted for approval sometimes include full vector CAD drawings in the data package, and that includes every single piece of content contained in the drawing. Any non-compliant drawing that breaks FAA rules can be rejected outright, and sometimes an entire batch of drawings gets kicked back at once. The FAA can even ground an entire fleet of aircraft if they decide you messed up something as small as the commas in a sentence describing how to install the toilet seat. On top of that, an FAA inspector is required to manually review every single drawing that has been modified for any aircraft in service. They have to see what changed, get an explanation for why, approve or reject that change, pass it on for final approval, and submit a request to update that specific airplane's documentation in every manual and document set that uses that vector element. That's a huge amount of work. The cost of that process can easily run into thousands of dollars for a single drawing change years later, and it's almost always paid by the company that screwed up. So yeah, going back through all of the nitpicker's old drawings was not a minor task. It wasn't some small slip-up, it was more like a $6 million screw-up in 2002 money. And some of that content actually ended up in official FAA documentation for aircraft that are still flying today, both passenger and cargo. Moral from your friendly Story Boar: when you build your kingdom on laziness, ego, and "we've always done it this way," don't be surprised when the paperwork mountain collapses right on your head. Respect the people who automate and protect your processes instead of fighting them, and never hide your own filth inside something that's supposed to keep other people safe. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone cling to their old, broken way of doing things until it blew up in their face? Or had a boss who sabotaged your work just to feel important? Tell me your stories in the comments. Maybe next time, it'll be your tale the boar is telling. You're watching Story Boar, where real emotions tell real stories.